So without further ado, we'll move into our first keynote address by Professor Katherine Gibson. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce her. She's a full professor in the Institute of Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. She's trained as a human geographer with expertise in political economy, and with her collaborator for over 30 years, the late Professor Julie Graham, has developed a distinctive approach to economic geography, drawing on feminism, post-structuralism, and action research. In the late 1990s, the collective authorial voice of J.K. Gibson Graham published The End of Capitalism as We Know It, a feminist critique of political economy. The Diverse Economies Research Program they subsequently initiated has become a vibrant subfield of study within the social sciences, resulting in a prolific output of publications, including in 2006, A Post-Capitalist Politics, and most recently, Take Back the Economy, an Ethical Guide to Transforming Our Communities. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gibson, whose talk today is entitled Thinking with Interdependence, From Economy/Environment to Ecological Livelihoods. Professor Gibson.
Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me okay? Big voice. Thank you for inviting me, Rob and Brown, to this conference, and thanks to the Centre for Place, Space and Society. That's a lot of terms very dear to my heart as a geographer. And also I'd like to thank my good friend Chizu Sato for inviting me, and also for Anka Vivs for signing me up to multiple seminars over the last few days with some wonderful graduate students, many of whom I think are here today, and early researchers from across the world. So I've already had an invigorating few days at Wageningen, and I just hope I've got some breath left for the conference. So just trying to reorganise the logistics here. Well, my lecture today is about practices of thinking and some recent experimentation with new ways of saying things. I'm not yet sure that this experiment is working, but I want to pretend that it is today for the moment and see what happens. And I hope that you'll enter into this experimental space with me, and I look forward to your reactions and feedback after the lecture. The presentation is based on some work that I'm doing with fellow Community Economies Collective member Ethan Miller. And some of these ideas were first explored in a very short essay in this book, Manifesto for Living in the Anthropocene, which I co-edited with Deborah Bird-Rose and Ruth Fincher. And what I'll be talking about today is coming out of a chapter that we've written for a reader called Thinking in the World, edited by Mary Zanazi and Jill Bennett, and they've started a book series around that title that's coming out with Bloomsbury Press. At the end of the lecture, I'll try and draw on some reflections from a field visit that I conducted last week. Well, the economy and environment are potent tools for organising a particular configuration of planetary power, one that tends to obscure many ethical dimensions of the relations that constitute us. These categories, economy, environment, reproduce a sense of inevitability in the face of ongoing ecological destruction, growing inequality, and entrenched injustice. They deflect complex negotiations of multi-species community and livelihood into modes of non-thought, such as jobs versus environment, cost-benefit analysis, or necessary trade-offs. These are formulations that appear to provoke serious collective consideration, yet in practice block the creative potentialities of thinking. They assume too much about what the world is made of, what is inevitable, and what may yet be transformed. I'm interested in counteracting contemporary articulations of the economy and the environment by rupturing their coherence from within and opening thinking towards new forms of collective life and solidarity, which I think are two of the key themes or central interests of this conference. So the lecture is going to proceed as follows. First, I want to briefly discuss the way that our oikos, our habitat, is divided into two tension-ridden domains that sever us from transformative ethically infused encounters with our constitutive interdependencies. Secondly, I want to explore how members of the Community Economies Collective have been rethinking economy and imagining and enacting community economies, and more recently, attempting to include more environmental concerns into a framework that evolved out of a much more human-focused post-structuralist feminism and anti-essentialist Marxist political economy. Then I want to discuss new work that's happening within the collective that's experimenting with kind of ditching the project of broadening the horizons of economy and is instead adopting a transversal language that disappears economy and environment within a particular conception of ecological livelihood. And lastly, I want to briefly discuss how politics of commoning and uncommoning is being pursued as a way of acting upon interdependence, and I'll try and illustrate this discussion with reference to a business enterprise that's attending in various ways to ecological livelihoods. So that's what I'm hoping to get through in the next hour. So first of all, the economy and the environment as we know them. At this point, it is a common sense. Something called the economy is the system by which most humans in industrialised nations effectively make their livings. It's composed of the dynamic monetary transactions associated with myriad producers and consumers. And I'm going to talk about the provenance of this slide a bit later on. And as you can tell, what I'm presenting here is a particular way of thinking. It's ultimately animated, this vision of economy, towards endless growth by the twin drivers of capitalist profit and individual utility maximisation. One can't easily deny or defy the economy, as it's widely understood to punish those who go against its logics or demands. It stands as a central site of intervention for government, policymakers, and the owners and managers of its central institutions, capitalist firms. At the same time, something called the environment confronts us from beyond, from the outside. It variously is constituted as a collection of resources to be mined, a space for dumping and discharging the wastes of production, a set of services to be rendered sustainable in their availability to human enjoyment and endless economic growth, or a sovereign limit-setting force of nature. In all cases, the environment stands as a distinct non-human realm to be variously ignored, managed, obeyed, or saved. The economy and environment then constitute a kind of hegemonic assemblage in contemporary life. Despite their extremely contingent historical production as core categories of industrial modernity, these terms appear in common understanding to name pervasive and inevitable contexts in which human action must unfold. They are assemblages, perhaps two parts of one assemblage, in the sense that they are constituted discursively and materially, produced by various practices of measurement, representation, institution, and discipline, and rendered semi-durable by their inculcation as habits of materiality and subjectivity. And here I'm just showing some of the ways in which people like Timothy Mitchell has tried to draw attention to the way that economies are produced through sorts of forms of calculation, forms of data collection, forms of representation. Similarly, I guess our understanding of ecologies or environments have been marshalled into new kinds of metrics like their impact through the ecological footprint. What these assemblages produce and in turn are produced by, what these assemblages produce is a form of life, an ontological formatting of a particular terrain in which certain kinds of problems and possibilities appear while others are rendered non-visible or pushed to the margins. So what is it that appears? First, we're confronted with a seemingly inevitable landscape of conflict and tension. The oikos is divided into two spheres of life that are effectively at war. So for those who are threatened with job loss and not being able to pay the rent or the mortgage or with an inability to educate their children, the economy, that is wage labour and debt, appears to be something in which they're obliged to participate at the threat of extinction. And the environment appears as something whose care merely detracts from these desperate priorities. And this is the kind of debate that we see happening in Australia all the time. You know, it's jobs versus environment. This frustrating agency deficit, married with a victim sensibility, is easily whipped up into simplistic and misdirected antagonisms, while at the same time, a coterie of experts are empowered to repeatedly reinforce this scene and pronounce the constraints within which we must live. You know, the bottom line. Thinking as a transformative practice of engaging a dynamic and possibility-filled world is shut down. The second set of consequences produced by the hegemonic articulation of economy and environment is the rendering invisible of a whole host of constitutive relations that lie outside the sphere of either the capitalist market or purified nature. On one side, the capitalist economy appears as the singular site for the production of livelihood, while at the same time excluding or marginalising vast swathes of human sustenance activity, all of the crucial labour and relationships that can't be capitalised, that can't be monetised, or in many cases can't even be measured. And you know, this has been one of the projects that feminists have been involved in for a long time, trying to bring to visibility all the other kinds of labour and care and community building that are part of living. Of course, socialist feminists tried to kind of smush them back into capitalism, but that's another story. On the other side, the economy appears as an external nature, while rendering invisible all of the complex ways in which human and more than human worlds are constitutively interwoven, inseparable, made up of myriad interdependencies that continually transgress all the divisions between nature and culture, wild and cultivated, urban and rural, creation and production. So trapped within these two poles of economy and environment, with both claiming the crown of the sovereign, the whole actual world of interdependent planetary sustenance is made exceedingly difficult to see, to engage, and to collectively negotiate. This hegemonic articulation anaesthetises us, as Isabel Stengers would say, to the demands of our complex interdependencies and to the ethical responsibilities and vulnerabilities that they call forth. To build new pathways for action and possibility in this era of planetary ecosystem destabilisation, the assemblage of economy and environment as we know them must be unmade. But how does one unmake an assemblage? Well, the starting point is a realisation that no assemblage is ever finally completed. Hegemony is never total. The assemblage is at once a site of instituting worlds and a site in which worlds are already always becoming otherwise. As powerful as economy and environment may be to map the terrain of possibility in contemporary life, these articulations fail to capture everything. They fail to cover all space with their measurements and modes of discipline, and are in fact shakier and less stable than their common sense appearance might suggest. And this is where I want to turn to the work that the Community Economies Collective has done and the kind of interventions that Julie and I started to make as J.K. Gibson Graham. So this insight about the instability of economic common sense has spurred development of J.K. Gibson Graham's Diverse Economies Research Program. And now I can explain where that image came from. It's the Turkish translation of our book that Rob mentioned and that came out in 1996, The End of Capitalism. The original version from Blackwell Press had Sisyphus rolling a stone up a hill, only to be kind of rolled down again, which was a kind of very dour, black, red, and kind of Germanic-looking kind of interpretation of our book. This is a much more fanciful repurposing of, I think, an environmental poster with capitalism churning up people and houses and it with its logics, gobbling up the world, and Julie and I being the kind of Davids trying to lob our little slingshots into the system to try and make it not work. Don't think we've succeeded yet, but hey, I'm still going. She's still helping me. Okay, it's precisely this task of amplifying this instability that we took on in our critique of capitalocentric models of economy. So poaching from post-structuralist feminism, we transferred phallogocentrism into capitalocentrism, that kind of discursive framing that positions anything else and non-capitalist practices as less important, more dependent, less dynamic, as contained somehow within space colonised by capitalism and ultimately becoming capitalist. So the diverse economies framework, which is often introduced by this image of a floating iceberg, and this is Ethan's kind of elaboration of it, where he's trying to smush in a lot of more than human processes as well as human processes. This image of the iceberg, which is transmogrified in many different ways, helps to identify and amplify the myriad practices and relations that continually escape the hegemonic narrative of the economy. These practices are shown below the waterline, submerged under those activities that are seen as part of the real economy. In other words, working for a wage or a salary in a job connected to a certain kind of business and transacting commoditised goods and services by the capitalist market. These things up there above the waterline. The diverse economies framing emerged from a critique of the politically debilitating effects of mainstream and leftist economic theorising. We kept thinking that the more and more we studied, new regimes of accumulation, forms of restructuring, we were just focusing more and more on the viability of this kind of construction of economy above the waterline, and not focusing enough on how these other things were going, how they were surviving the millennia, how they were in fact keeping more people alive in the world than these kind of practices. This kind of what we've tried to develop is to an expanded vocabulary that liberates economic difference from capitalocentrism. So in a diverse economy, capitalist activities, that's wage labour, capitalist enterprise and formal markets, are convened on a kind of single plane with a wide variety of other forms of labour and their different modes of compensation or freedom or non-compensation, different enterprise forms and their distinctive modes of surplus appropriation and distribution, and different forms of transaction and their ways of negotiating commensurability or incommensurability in the case of non-market transactions. So we convene these all on a single plane, a radically heterogeneous landscape of economic practice. The driving dynamisms of this diverse, more than capitalist economy can't be interpreted via some kind of rote narrative of the logics of the market or the logics of accumulation. They need to be empirically investigated and creatively theorised. And in our most recent book, Take Back the Economy, we added into this kind of conception diverse forms of property and diverse forms of finance. Much of our past writing, though, is focused on rethinking and reframing economy from this hegemonic space of capitalist dominance to an always indeterminate space of diverse relationships, identifying existing practices and alternative economic subjectivities, and trying to negotiate or try to identify where ethical negotiation is taking place so that they can be kind of foregrounded and strengthened as strategies for potential transformation. So the language of, this is an inventory process. It's really just a deconstructive move, taking the master term, making it many and making its other many, and convening it on this kind of flat plane. Our kind of more positive, political project has been to generate a language of what we call the community economy. This has been a central strategy for fostering counter-hegemonic assemblages or assemblage tipping, where community refers not to locality or shared identity, but to the raw ethical exposures of coexistence in our myriad relations of sustenance. So our commitment has been to making community economies more real, bringing to visibility and helping to strengthen a set of particular concerns. So here, we've been interested in, rather than just talking about work, talking about how it is that we configure surviving well. How do we put together various labour practices in order to live well and not just survive well ourselves, but for others surviving well and for, in a sense, the planetary surviving well. So the idea of surviving well, which I think fits a lot with this kind of conception of well-being that we heard about this morning, which is also very problematic, is a very key concern of community economies, and it is a key site of ethical deliberation. In terms of thinking about business or enterprise, we've focused, and here you can see our kind of Marxist genealogy, focused on businesses or enterprise as a site of wealth generation, of surplus generation, beyond what the people making the enterprise need to live on. And then the different mechanisms by which enterprises in different formats appropriate and distribute surplus. That is the kind of one of the sites where wealth generation takes place through the use of human labour, but of course there's a lot of wealth generation that's taking place through environmental exploitation, and this is something that is problematic and another site of ethical negotiation. When we're thinking about transactions, we're really trying to focus on what are the encounters that are taking place through those transactions. Encounters with each other, with people at a distance, and with environments near and far. And then when it comes to thinking about property, whether material or immaterial, our focus is now on commoning, the idea of the ways in which we organise social relationships around property. I'll come back to that later on. And then our kind of very simplistic analysis of what finance is really about storing stuff up so that you can have a future, and so we're kind of interested in the ways in which different kinds of financial mechanisms actually invest in futures. So from a community economy perspective then, economy signals oikos or habitat, the multiple practices that support life. And in our view, community is a kind of empty space of possibility wherein our being in common is actively negotiated. And here we're taking from the work of Jean-Luc Nancy, a French philosopher. So community is something, and it's a very freighted term, obviously, and very freighted in different languages. But it's something that in our view, is something that is continually being made and remade. Its boundaries are fluid. Its ethical commitments are continually being challenged and are evolving. But in our work, both historically and the way in which this kind of stream of thinking has developed, both the notion of community and negotiating in community and economy have been seen as practices primarily involving humans. More recently, in multiple collaborations, we've sought to bring more than human ecological relations into this expanded economic space of becoming. And we've challenged ourselves to think of being in common as a multi-species, human and non-human community. A we that includes all of those with whom human livelihoods are interdependent and interrelated. And here we've drawn on thinking particularly within the environmental humanities and post-humanist ecological thought. And in terms of ecological humanities, particularly the work of Val Plumwood and Deb Bird-Rose. And this is just a wonderful quote from Val that has inspired a lot of our work in this vein, how it is that we go onward in a different mode of humanity. And this kind of work has increasingly challenged the hyper-separated notions of an external nature. This work begins to map the complex inter-becomings of a more than human ecological mesh. What emerges from this work is a profound sense of the world that lies beyond the hegemonic assemblage, a world of becoming in which Earth inhabitants are connected in ways that humans barely imagine, and responsible to and with each other in ways that we can barely grasp, much less fully respond to. And in a way in which we're called then towards new possibilities for world making that have only just begun to be glimpsed. So, this is a tricky place to be, coming out of a kind of more social science background. But as collective members, as we reflect now on the dense kind of anaesthetising articulations of the economy and the environment that I've just gone through, we've been called to try and experiment with a different language to express this broad project. So we've asked ourselves, what if we were to stop trying to re-signify the economy, reframe it, take it back, continually battling its hegemonic connotations by trying to qualify it, trying to make it ethical, by joining it to a notion of becoming communities? What if instead we were to mobilise a different, more kind of transversal language for the articulation of transformative relations that move beyond the economy-environment machine? So, building on the substance and spirit of this past work, we're now seeking, or at least some of us are seeking to transpose into a new key. And this is what I want to go on to now, about a new kind of way of thinking with interdependence. So instead of thinking along the lines of an economy and an environment, Ethan and I are experimenting with reconstituting the landscape of current action and possibility in terms of ecological livelihoods. This term livelihood is commonly used to indicate, quite generally, the work of sustenance. It's a term of practice, of experience, a simple articulation of complex lives lived and negotiated from the inside, rather than categorised from without. Livelihood is what unfolds in the space of life's action, the middle space in which the hegemonic division of economy-environment blurs and dissolves into the power-laden specificities of encounter and negotiation. Livelihood indicates a diversity of activity, a variety of capacities, skills and knowledges, a plethora of possible sites of action, and multiple configurations of ever-changing relations and processes that can't be captured by a generality. Livelihood resists unification under a singular standard of measure, an image of action, or a domain of life. When invoked, it most often comes linked to particular contexts, stories and strategies. How do people make a living here and there? Well, we do it in all kinds of ways. Moreover, livelihood has the nice kind of resonance of the term lively, which beckons towards some kind of normative commitment to joy in the sense of enhancing the body's capacities through connection. It also serves to remind us of the lively matter in which we participate and from which we continually emerge. Now, of course, for many people, livelihood is a term that's already been mobilised in certain ways. It's certainly been mobilised as a key concept by Karl Polanyi and his work on the livelihood of man, or in the whole sustainable livelihoods approach developed by Robert Chambers and other people, particularly those here at this university. Here, it's been used to displace, in an interesting way, the hegemony of paid work and monetary exchanges by capitalist markets. So this use of that term is focused on humans making livings through all kinds of paid and unpaid work, reciprocated and unreciprocated activities, and in relation to all kinds of institutions, motivations and contexts. At the same time, however, these approaches all tend to merge the economic and social without challenging an articulation of the environment as a domain of resources. It's physical capital, natural capital. The human remains at the centre of action, and often in the form of individual and households, still navigates or optimises amidst a world of objects or resources. And in the Sustainable Livelihoods program or project, it's all about mobilising the 5 capitals, where nature gets kind of smushed into physical capital and natural capital, and everything else gets social capital, human capital, etc. So to develop a truly transversal articulation that cuts across and through the hegemonic categories and opens new ethical and political space, livelihoods must be articulated in a more radically ecological sense. And by ecological here, I'm referring not to a synonym for environmental, nor to its common mobilisation as a kind of scientific holism. Rather, I mean it as precisely that which escapes domestication or even signification. As Szymanski puts it, not the name of a totality, but the impossibility of any such totality. This is, I think, Timothy Morton's sense of ecology in the ecological thought, the mind-boggling interdependence that we can never master, never know, and that calls us towards and ethics that we've only begun to explore. Livelihoods would indicate then the complex, reciprocally negotiated composition of habitat, or oikos, and that also, it would also signify that which inhabits us along with others. Livelihoods must refer then to something that we've called eco-poiesis, the active creation, poiesis, of oikos, habitat. Now, the point here is not to propose that thinking in terms of ecological livelihoods is somehow more accurate to what is really happening out there. In other words, that we're seeking to reveal a new truth with this approach. Language, as I think many of us have accepted by now, is performative. It helps to bring into being that which it names. So to speak of ecological livelihoods is really to propose an intervention. What kind of relations, connections, and possibilities might be opened up by a language that refuses to distinguish an economy and an environment as the ultimate spheres in which we must live? What might it do to say instead that we make our livings in diverse ways, in complex, power-laden relations of interdependence that can't be reduced to or contained by the hegemonic articulation? This is the kind of experimental proposition, in Latour's terms, that we're working with. So, what is this? How can we elaborate this proposition? Well, livelihood can be understood or mapped in terms of three dimensions: making a living, receiving a living made for us by others, both human and non-human, and providing livings for others. I or we are continually emergent at the convergence of these three dimensions. Making a living is obviously the dimension of livelihoods most often and overtly acknowledged. We weave together multiple life-making activities, including paid work as well as unpaid work, buying, sharing, swapping, giving goods and services, working for others in private enterprises or for ourselves in small businesses, or with others in cooperatively owned and run enterprise or not-for-profits or social enterprise. In all these kinds of activities, this work, humans or others exercise particular forms of perception, skill, knowledge, and power. This active work of doing, producing, procuring the means of subsistence is the classic site often associated with agency. It's that worker identity that has been here, has been the locus of any kind of critical political mobilisation in the last 200 years. And it serves as a key form of social validation for many people. Making a living, autopoiesis, is both how we are made and how some of us are unmade, and can become a site of disastrous failure and shame. How difficult is it for so many of us to see that making a living is not, in fact, ultimately the work of individuals. It is rather the key site where a particular agency condenses, congeals, or is momentarily realised, while its actual sources are distributed throughout the whole triple assemblage of livelihood relations. This is precisely why it's not enough to reduce livelihood to the work of making, that agency, making a living. Prior to any making of a living, we receive things made by others. This is the livelihood dimension that we also call allopoiesis, allo from the outside. Our culture is ripe with praise for those who are represented as pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps. Yet we are all utterly dependent on beings and forces that exceed us. Consider those, for example, at a distance whose labour makes our lives possible. The people that made the cereal that we ate this morning, or the milk that was on our cereal. Or the web of plants, animals, microbes and geological formations that feed, clothe, warm and heal us. We all rely fundamentally on the labours of human and non-human others. We're all on the dole. Some of our constitutive others we know, most of them we'll never know. And a whole host of ethical questions are opened up here, since we do not even know with whom we're connected. And finally, we provide livings for others. Despite all the emphasis on self-making in the hegemonic articulation, So much of what we do is about making livings for others, those we know and those we'll never know. In some cases, this takes the form of involuntary relations, such as exploitation in capitalist firms that provide surplus for owners at our expense. Or it could take the form of playing host to other kinds of parasites, or becoming compost when we die. In other cases, providing for and making others forms a core part of our intention. Birthing the next generation, as Rob's just done. Supporting our families, contributing to our communities, caring for our places, or enacting solidarity with those who live beyond the immediate bounds of daily connection. Does this alter poiesis become a site of resentment as we support those who we feel to be undeserving? Or does it become a site of hospitality and generosity? It is with us and from us regardless. To bring this triad of relations together, we emerge as a site of continually enacted agential articulation between the habitats we make for ourselves, the habitats that we receive, and the habitats we participate in making for others. I and we become relays in a complex ecological meshwork, and a politics of the negotiation of ecological livelihoods unfolds here. Life, then, is the negotiation of multiple, overlapping, co-constituting habitats. The framing of ecological livelihood sketched out here challenges the conceptual or conventional frame in which each of these three dimensions is partially obscured by the enclosures and exclusions of the economy and the environment. And it's taken us, I think, quite some time, us humans, quite some time to see that the living we receive is being severely compromised by our actions to make a living. It seems even harder for us to recognise that our ability to provide safe living for others, particularly future generations, is diminished in drastic ways. So to challenge these categories and ask instead about the relations themselves is to radically foreground collective mutual dependence. It's to ask dangerous questions about how we actually make our livings, who we're truly dependent upon, and to whom we might be obligated. And these kinds of questions, I think, we started to frame in Take Back the Economy around community economy concerns. But now I'm kind of we're trying to reconfigure those questions in terms of the questions around making a living. What do we really need to survive well? How do we balance our survival needs with those of others and the planet? What are the range of ways that we secure things that we don't produce ourselves? And how do we conduct ethical encounters with human and non-human others in these transactions? After all, what do we really need to consume, and how do we consume sustainably and justly? And you can see that these are already the sites of a lot of organisation and social movements and economic movements. They are taking on these ethical questions already. When it comes to having a living made for us, the kinds of questions we might be thinking about what are the gifts that we receive from others, from nature and from past generations that enable us to live well? And I think this is incredibly important, living in societies where, we are benefiting from the gifts or the theft of past eras of colonialism, the theft of land from other people. How is it that we're receiving something that even wasn't considered a gift but was taken? And what is it that then gives us the right to say, no, we're the people that live in Australia, and you refugees have to go out to an internment camp in the Pacific Islands because we are the people that are this place and you can't come in. How does a community maintain, replenish and grow the kind of natural and cultural commons that are central to survival? And how do we share and make these things with human and non-human others? These are kind of questions that I think are being, again, focused on when it comes to, in the case of Australia, questions of water. Does the river, the Murray River, have the right to its own ecological flow, to its own water? Or is the right to that water the select province of those farmers who are supposedly then feeding the world? How do we consider our interdependency and make them more visible while recognising the impossibility of any complete accounting? What forms of responsibility can we construct toward the others, other beings, other places, other times, whose bodies and worlds are shaped by the makings that we take and receive from them? And how do we gain, as the well-known Serenity Prayer has it, the wisdom to discern the difference between those dependencies that can be transformed and those to which we're truly at the mercy? There's only so much we can do around some of these things. And lastly then, in terms of making livings for others, the kinds of questions or struggles are focused on things like, to whom are we obliged to offer ourselves, our energies and our lives? What's left after our survival needs have been met? What do we do with the surplus that we generate? How do we enrich social and environmental health? How are our makings of others connected with our being made? Recirculating energies and matter in a way that inhabit our habitats and those of others? And to what extent is this connection severed by various extractive mediations? What do we do with stored wealth? How is this wealth invested so that future generations may live well? And to what extent are these relations shaped by forms of coercion and violence, and to what extent can we transform such relations? So various sites of struggle emerge around each of these questions when the grip of economy and environment is loosened. The questions open up what possibilities there are for new modes of collective life, and what might emerge when livelihood and its negotiations are articulated in more ecologically and ethically oriented frame. So the concepts of commoning and uncommoning, to which I want to now turn, can help, I think, to make the ethico-political stakes and the dynamics of this reframing even clearer. The language of ecological livelihoods is a tool then, and I'm proposing it as an experimental tool. I'm sure I'll get a lot of feedback. As a tool for de-anaesthetising. It's a strategy for thinking in and with the world that we are continually becoming. It's not a proposal for an alternative system, a vision for how we all should or could live, nor is it a vehicle for the elevation of a specific set of codified morals. It is about opening new space for emergence, spaces where we can learn to be affected in a world that becomes more highly differentiated when we do so. But can effective transformative politics grow then from a perspective that appears oriented only towards opening questions and proliferating sites of encounter? Well, we'd like to propose that the practice of commoning can be seen as the collective politicisation of livelihood. The term commoning, initially drawn from the work of Peter Leinborg and Massimo De Angelis, has been taken up by members of the Community Economies Collective and many, many others in recent years as a language for articulating the politics of explicit, collectively negotiated interdependence. Commoning, or making common, refers to the myriad ways in which complex relations of livelihood are rendered into explicit sites of ethical negotiation. Sites of negotiation around access, use, benefit, care, responsibility of those things that are supporting life. And in our Take Back the Economy, we had this kind of way of representing ways of commoning. The ways we have of renegotiating things that have been enclosed, creating new commons, and commoning unmanaged open access resources. And you'll see here that we're focusing on the processes of commoning, the ways that access is negotiated, use, benefit, care, and responsibility, and we're kind of de-emphasising the form of property that is associated with these processes. So that our argument is that commoning can take place, the kind of social relationships of commoning and negotiation can take place around many different kinds of property. We're not doing a kind of a one-on-one relationship that commons, it has to be public property or collectively owned property versus private property. And I think I'll demonstrate that later on when I talk about a company that I think is a site of commoning. The practice of commoning then involves identifying and supporting practices that render our interdependencies explicit and open to collective negotiation and transformation, and challenging and dismantling all that seeks to close these spaces down. Commoning constitutes then shared and explicit matters of concern, to take up Latour's kind of terminology. And here, matter should be taken in both senses of the word at once, what matters and what the matter is that we're negotiating around. It's not that all things shared are common, but that all shared matters are common, to the extent that they appear as questions, concerns, or sites of struggle and action and decision. Commoning then is at the heart of labours of thinking in and with the world. Such labour unfolds then as the composition of an innumerable set of variable spheres of concern and negotiation that articulate livelihood triads together in explicitly common habitat assemblages. And this is a rather complex kind of vision of the way in which the ecological livelihoods mesh together with different kinds of habitats and assemblages where these kind of negotiations are continually ongoing. Particular ecosystems, diseases, experiences of shared oppression, cultural traditions, mutual relations with distant others, the planetary climate system, all may be commoned by their rendering as sites of connection and negotiation. Commonings are the sites where oikos, habitats, overlap, converge, and become sites for asking the critical and transformative question, how will we humans and Earth others live together? As sites of connection and community, commonings are also often boundary drawing sites, since they entail explicit relations between particular participants and not others, particular negotiated settlements and stalemates that must often be bounded in order to remain stable. Thus, commoning cannot always be contrasted, as it often is, with enclosure. While some enclosures disrupt and destroy commons, for example, the privatisation of water, others actually constitute them. A community says, this water is ours, we share it, it can't be privatised. That's a kind of boundary drawing. So this ethico-political question must then shift from its commonly articulated form as commons versus enclosure to what enclosure, for whom, for what purpose, and to what effect. It matters a great deal which side of a given enclosure one ends up standing on. For clarity's sake, then, we oppose processes of commoning with those of uncommoning. If commoning is a making explicit of the negotiations of the common, then uncommoning is an anaesthetisation of the common, an ethical closure, or a rendering non-negotiable of habitat relations. So the commodity form, for example, as Marx showed us, renders our interdependence with others into a site of uncommoning to the extent that the social relations of production, and thus our potentials for transformative connection, are obscured. But there are forms of commodities where those kinds of relationships are not obscured and are common. And I had a wonderful conversation yesterday with Marianne here about the commodified food production of the food sharing platform that is explicitly opening up the transaction, the ethical transaction, that is part and parcel of that movement of food to money to food, from mouth to mouth. Uncommoning in its various forms is not a non-common, since being in common itself cannot be undone as a shared condition of existence, as Jean-Luc Nancy points out. Nor does uncommoning always entail the destruction of commons. Uncommoning is, in a strange way, still an articulation of the common and even a production of commons, that is, of a shared matter of concern. But this production is often alienated or estranged, dispossessed in varying degrees of the means of encounter, negotiation, and responsibility. The conventional capitalist factory, for instance, is a space of the common. It's a shared existence for those who work there. But until workers or managers organise to challenge or rupture capitalist discipline and alienation, it remains an uncommoned common, or a common site of uncommoning. Well, that's a lot of stuff, a lot of ideas. And let me just end, let me change gear a little bit and end with an example of, at least an attempt at an example of what I'm trying to talk about. I want to illustrate this kind of politics of comedy with reference to the ecological livelihoods that I see being connected to an envelope factory called Pacheco, a privately owned, not-for-profit social business that's located some 10 kilometres from Lille in northern France, in a region with very high unemployment. And for any of you who might have seen the film Demain, or Tomorrow, that was recently made, this factory features as one of the stories. And I had the pleasure of spending a day there just a week or so ago. Over the last 10 years, and under the direction of Emmanuel Drouin, its philosopher-owner, and author of a book called Ecolonomy, where he's trying to put ecology and economy obviously together, Pacheco has been evolving by acknowledging its interdependence with human and non-human livelihoods, both near and far. It's totally reorganised its production processes, negotiating ways to increase the well-being of ecological livelihoods in multiple habitats. A few examples, I think, will illustrate how. The factory originated, the actual plant, in the 19th century as a plant for making jute bags for agricultural produce. And as you can see, it's located in the midst of a rural area and right next to a protected wetland, which is that kind of green area in the distance around the Lac du Huron. Its design was of another era. And so one of the major transformations that's been made has been to progressively replace the old tiled roof of this factory with a new roof capable of generating solar energy, capturing water, allowing light into the factory and using natural ventilation for cooling. The job of replacing this roof had to take place over a fully functioning factory so that production and income generation could continue uninterrupted. With no existing architects or roofers who could design and execute such a task, Pacheco marshalled a team of engineers who experimented and learnt on the job of how to accomplish this complex outcome. And in fact, now the knowledge they have of trying to replace a roof while the production's still going on is something that they're helping other companies with in a kind of consultancy. As part of this process, a group of landscape architects were commissioned to roll out green turf on the flat parts of the roof. And you can see some of the areas where the green turf is. However, when the plant species that were to be made up to make up this green roof were analysed, they included many which, if spread into the surrounding ecosystem, would become voracious invaders of the local native species. So with the well-being of the local environment a big consideration, the decision was made to refuse the services of these consultants and go to the local authority who would source green roof plants that were compatible with the surrounding vegetation. So the factory roof now houses beehives, which you can see on the green roof, and produces honey, as well as providing all the other inputs of water, energy, light and cooling. And this is the kind of light that comes in, so that a lot of other lighting isn't necessarily needed as much, and the way in which the cooling system's working, sucking out the hot air and bringing in the cool. The factory walls contain bathhouses, and the whole surrounding part of the factory is a functioning part of the local ecosystem, providing for multiple plant, insect and animal species. Just along we walked along this factory where those plants were all raspberries, and we were able to pick them off and eat them as we went. The transparency of transactions with other habitats is further traced as part of the procurement of paper from sustainable forests at some distance. Much of the paper is sourced from Finland, and each roll contains documentation of where the wood came from. As the paper feeds through the production process to become envelopes, this provenance is tracked, and each box of envelopes records where the paper has come from. This certification here, the PEFC, is from this independent NGO, the Program for Endorsement of Forest Certification. So the consumer can be connected back through the supply chain to a particular hectare of forest in a particular geographic site. This transparency then allows for the ethics of transactions to be interrogated. And of course, it raises a whole lot of issues around, still, I think, around plantation forests and so on, and whether that's a benefit to that local ecosystem. But at least there is an attempt to try and make those connections through these kinds of metrics and technology for tracking. A switch to water-based inks for printing has meant that the wastewater from the factory can be filtered and returned to the environment, and the filtration is done via what they call a bamboo prairie. It doesn't look like a prairie to me, but anyway, it's a bamboo forest, I would say. The surrounding the factory are the fruit-bearing trees and plants and a permaculture garden, which I showed before. And ultimately, the plan is to transition from envelope making, which after all is a kind of a legacy product. I mean, the only people that use envelopes anymore are large banks and telecommunication companies that send out bills and statements, but most of that kind of work is now being done digitally. This is a product that is going to disappear in the next 10 to 15 years, and the transition that this company is working on is towards more intensive permaculture. And it's going to be quite an interesting task to talk to these workers, many of whom have been working in the company for the average time in the company is more than 12 years, to think about their future as not envelope makers, but permaculture workers. And this is something that is a discussion going on. On Pacheco's website, it states outright that, as a little footnote there, we reject financial capitalism. The company's results are systematically reinvested in the company, no dividends. Indeed, Pacheco is registered as a privately owned non-profit company. It has a flat management structure with a 1 to 4 difference in incomes between the top worker and the bottom worker. And a steering committee of 3 men and 3 women heads up the company. So any new applicant for jobs spends a day with the person that they're going to work with, and then comes back a week later to spend time with the members of the steering committee, and the final decision about employment is made by the person that they work with. So it has some very interesting kinds of social relations that are structuring the way in which a human habitat or making a living is being achieved. So Pacheco can be seen as one example of a site of overlapping habitats where transparent negotiations about how we live together are taking place, and where commoning in the form of new shared action and commitment is alive and well. It's a site where some 150 people are making a living. Through its transactions, it acknowledges and takes responsibility for not damaging the habitats both near and far of those that enable this living to be made. And it also provides a living for many others in a multi-species community. So finally then, one could be forgiven for concluding that humans today, especially those residing in our nooks of the minority developed world, have decided to stop thinking for themselves, and certainly of others. In the post-fact era, critical thought is not encouraged, and creative, empathetic thinking is deemed suspect. Yet never before have there been stronger calls to attend to the world and wake up from the anaesthesia-inducing flow of information about who we can be, what we can and should have, and which others might be standing in the way of our self-fulfillment. These calls should form the condition of possibility for thought. Indeed, should force thought, not merely as an act of a rational individual self, but as an emergent collective response with, as, against, and for the world. What I've proposed in this lecture is not a call for a pure invention of a new mode of life. It is rather about building on and from the other modes of life that are already present in the cracks, and perhaps even the heart of hegemony. How are we sustained by others? How do we sustain others? Who is ourselves? How do we participate in sustaining others? And where are the moments, practices, and institutions of commoning in our midst that are rendering these questions into sites of collective struggle and deliberation? I've given just one example, and I think it's our collective task to identify, amplify, and cultivate thousands more. Of course, I can't give any guarantee that the amplification and connection of multiple diverse forms of commoning will be enough to meet the planetary challenges we face, but I refuse to be certain that they will not be enough. Those of us in the Community Economies Collective are seeking to find ways to make the interdependencies of our webs of receiving, making, and providing more visible, and thus to open up new spaces for commoning across the boundaries and divisions that have so often been built between us. We can refuse to accept that there is something called the economy and something called the environment that we must choose between. And I think these graphs of the great acceleration that have been, really a big influence most recently on my thinking. This is the work that Will Steffen and friends have put together that just visually show, these trajectories of Earth system trends and socio-economic trends. And as I said yesterday in that seminar, I think that the dotted line is 1950. The acceleration of these trends has just, taken off. As someone who was born in the 1950s, I identify with these graphs in some kind of visceral way, and I feel like these kinds of things are speaking to us, that there's no such separation of these two spheres. They tell me that there is no choice, that the Earth systems and the socio-economic systems are interdependent, and we have to start thinking of them in new ways as such. I've argued that we can choose to focus on the transversal relations of ecological livelihood rather than the divided spheres of this hegemonic articulation we've inherited. We might then become more effectively able to foster a world in which fewer and fewer of us are forced to choose between feeding our families versus being hospitable to unknown others, or between a steady job and a viable planetary life-supporting system for future generations. To paraphrase Spinoza, we do not yet know what our commonings of ecological livelihood can do. Thank you.
Would you like to just take questions from the podium?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. We have a roving microphone. Where's the roving microphone? All right, well, we have a half hour for questions and answers. We have a roaming microphone that will hopefully present itself at some point, but if you can speak and project your voice from the diaphragm. Any questions for our keynote?
You can also just think along with me. You don't have to ask a question, you can just make another statement.
Please stand up.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. It made me think a lot about relationality, which obviously is the key topic that you spoke about as well, and ways of valuing relationality in the framework which you propose. Could we speak about that for a few minutes? And please, not about ecosystem services.
No. Yeah. I don't know that I can say a lot more than I've already said, but I think obviously relationality is a key aspect here if we're talking about interdependence. And relations of care, of course, which I think we'll hear a lot more of tomorrow, are also a part of that and part and parcel of that kind of relationality. And maybe you've got something to add in terms of how you're working on this topic and how you find it difficult perhaps to intersperse questions of relationality in the ways in which you're working. Do you want to share something on that?
Sure. My project is currently looking at how we are changing in agricultural production the relationship between, or how the relationship between farmers and soils is changing in agricultural production. And what I am coming, and what the farmers that I speak to have to come to terms with, is the incompatibility of the ways that they want to relate to the soil as an unknown and unknowable ecosystem on which they depend, and the ways that soils are related to through capital-intensive agricultural production. So for them, and I am working with farmers in the developed world, the conflict is not resolvable in one sphere. The sphere of capital makes the kind of caring for soil that they would like to practice impossible. It doesn't help, it gets in the way rather. So for me, these questions about making the different forms of interdependence, which are not only about the reproduction of capital, valuable, valued, celebrated, noticeable, but most of all valuable in some way that sustains rather than gets in the way of livelihoods is very important. And I don't have any answers.
No, but that gives me a little bit more of a lead onto what you're interested in. And interestingly, I mean, I had a student working with me on soil, and she's actually moved to another university now, but her research will be interesting for you to look up. And I'm going to blank on her name. No, her name's Anne. But and she was very interested. I mean, I think there's a whole movement, I think, around the world, and certainly in Australia, of farmers starting to reacquaint themselves with soil communities. There's a group at my university where farmers come and learn to use microscopes, learn to look at the biota, look at the communities that live in soil, and what happens to them when fertilizer is used and so on. So there's a whole interest in the communities that one needs to work with and the habitats that are provided within soil for fungi, biota, etc., that is really reshaping a lot of agriculture, I think, and probably is being used also in questions in the developing world where people are returning to, say in the Philippines, the movement Masipa, which is moving back to older rice varieties that were much more part of a diverse ecosystem, where the soil was replenished in certain ways, and without the scientific knowledge, perhaps, of the different microbes and so on that live there, there have been practices that have obviously developed over thousands of years to actually work with soil and produce a kind of resilience that got kind of slightly obliterated or wiped out by the Green Revolution. But anyway, I think there is a group of people who are learning to be affected by soil biota, by the communities, and not seeing soil as just a substrata that holds up the plant, this kind of physical matter that is just there. And that is reshaping the agricultural practices. I know, for instance, in Australia there's a move, and probably all of you agricultural people will know this, but a move against ploughing and just using these drill points so that the soil isn't disturbed. I mean, our whole history of Western agriculture in Australia has been to basically scarify the topsoil and allow it to blow away. And all the soil profiles, because it's such an old continent and they're so shallow, in many areas they've been lost. And now, of course, there's a lot more understanding that, the land management that Indigenous people can practiced over thousands of years produced the environment that the settlers from Europe came in and saw, oh, this is an interesting kind of parkland look, empty of people. Oh, isn't that nice? We can have our sheep and cut down a few more trees and so on. It was a very balanced ecosystem where, farming and, gathering and a kind of farming and fire-stick farming, as it's called, was a way of continually replenishing soil. How that scientifically created the kind of communities that live in soil, I don't know, but there's a lot of interest in this area. So that's a place where I think, relationality is really directing a kind of scientific agenda, and then a kind of new form of farming practice, which is greatly needed. So, yeah, and I think that's probably happening in lots of different fields. And again, it's just one of the many examples we could start to marshal to show how the rational actor farmer is affected. I mean, I've had a wonderful interview with a farmer who can also pinpoint the moment in which he, after a 10-year drought in the region around Canberra, on Christmas Day, which is of course for us in the height of summer, he walked to the edge of his property, which was just bare earth, blowing away, from the kind of farming practices that he was a leader in the scientific farming of the region, He walked to the highway, and where the fence was for his land and the little verge between that and the road, there were these weeds and grasses all growing. And he looked at it and he went, what is going on here? And from that moment, he changed, totally changed his farming practice, and he was, the laughing stock of the whole community and all the agricultural officers that came to visit. He just stopped, started to revegetate his land, put trees back, and redeveloped a whole way of farming native plants, the seeds, bird life came back. The whole ecosystem of the farm was changed through this moment where something spoke to him, seeing this. The world spoke to him in some way. And now, when I visited his farm, again, it was in another long-term drought. It was like this little green jewel in amongst a landscape that was just brown.
Do you want to have a microphone, maybe? Oh, thank you. I mean, I don't want to take time away from others. I will just summarize very, very briefly. I think your history is the story that you just recounted is very typical. And especially what struck me is what you said, that he was the laughingstock of the farming community. This is a very familiar story for me from other conversations with farmers. And it's exactly this that is bothering me. So we talk about these trailblazers and people who are affected, and they change, and they're going against the current. And maybe today and tomorrow and the day after, an opportunity to think about changing the current.
And he now is part of a bigger movement of farmers who are quite a significant movement, and they've got quite a bit of public, there's been some wonderful films made about their work, and it is having an influence at a wider scale. So the Trailblazers do get many followers, and then there are other people trying things out. The other area that those farmers have worked with is different ways of managing water in the landscape. Again, undoing the way that engineering managed to channel all of our rivers. Most of Australian rivers are underground. They you only see the water in the riverbed for a few months of the year. The rest of the water is all underground. And so the engineering model was to kind of dig bigger channels to get the water out there. And now there's this whole move towards natural sequence farming, which is to allow the water to spread out over the landscape and work with its patterns. So again, it's a kind of opening to learning and relationality and learning in new ways. So,
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Stine from the University of Copenhagen. From anthropology, I work on kind of human, non-human relationships in relationship to political activism, both here in Europe and also in Latin America and Ecuador. I've been a great fan of your work since I was an early, young researcher and activist. I think some of your texts have always been with me. But I think over the years I've also had some doubts about, we can say, some of these alternative spaces, alternative projects of kind of creating the otherwise, or creating those alternative relationships to the economy, to the what we call nature that we want to see. And it seems to me that when you look at them over time, sometimes maybe not the example you were just discussing, but also many projects run out of steam in different ways. They are faced with both with suppression in various forms, but also with exhaustion from within. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on the temporality of these different kinds of projects? what are their durability in time, and what are,
Have you got a particular thing you're thinking about when you're asking that question? A particular context or struggle?
I think you can see in Europe at least many different activist spaces where you try to, like some of even some of the economic projects, like the one we were presenting here, that when you look at them over time, they are faced with certain kind of challenges. It can also be more kind of autonomous communes type of projects and so on. But also even some indigenous struggles that run up against where you might experiment or continue living with other kinds of relation to what we now call non-human beings. But that are also faced with many challenges also from within, and seem to sometimes run out of steam as time goes by in different ways. So, of course, I don't want to take away the hopefulness. I hold on to that also, but in a certain way, there also seems to be certain challenges and I wonder what your kind of academic thoughts. What are the temporality of this commoning process?